When I was a young boy, I loved Disneyland. I don't know how often I went there, but since I grew up in California, it was something that our family did fairly often, every couple of years at least. And it's amazing to me how I still remember so much of how it felt when I was just a young boy. I was probably 4 or 5 years old the first time we went. And then I remember going back and having those same wonderful feelings when I was in junior high school and high school. And then in college, I went to college in Santa Barbara, so it was even closer. And then I went to graduate school, seminary in the Los Angeles area. And for most of the 1980s, I went to Disneyland 3 or 4 times a year. And the reason was because I was doing youth ministry in Southern California, and every junior high kid of every youth group I ever did wanted to go to Disneyland with a youth group. And so, of course, what could I say? I'll suffer and take you to Disneyland. But then the high school group also wanted to go, and I thought, oh, darn, I've got to go twice this year. And a few years, there was a young adult group, or all of the youth workers, the volunteers wanted to go. And so I would often go about 3 times a year. And just this last week, I was just kind of counting up in my head how much business I brought Disneyland over those years. And I remember that they used to send me like 2 free passes every year. And I thought, every couple of years, I brought at least 100 young people to Disneyland. And I thought, oh, how smart for them to send me those, because every year I would go to Disneyland just with a friend and enjoy it without any responsibilities, overseeing young people who might get their feelings hurt because their little group wasn't as nice to them as they were to somebody else, or, middle school. There's all this drama and stuff. But I enjoyed it all. But I remember going just with one friend, and I thought, I can go anywhere I want in Disneyland, do anything I want. And I remember thinking back then what a genius Walt Disney was, and what an incredible imagination he had, because back in the 1930s and 40s, he started imagining what Disneyland could be someday. And he imagined what it would feel like to every child, teenager, and adult that went there. He imagined not only what it felt like, but what it looked like, what it sounded like, what it smelled like, and what it tasted like. I still remember how all of my senses were engaged when I went to Disneyland as a young kid. One of my favorite areas was, what was it called? New Orleans Square, I think, where they had the smells being, I think, pushed out among the crowd, so you would just be drawn in to have a beignet and a mint julep, a virgin mint julep, of course. But anyway, there were the smells and the tastes and the beautiful music from New Orleans that was being played there, and everything looked like you were actually there in New Orleans. And every different part of Disneyland that you went to, you felt like you were in a different part of the world, and sometimes even in a different place and time, like Tomorrowland. Well, as I thought about how Walt Disney imagined and continued to imagine during that time, and as I was thinking about it this week, it occurred to me what was happening in our country during the 1930s and 40s and the 50s until Disneyland finally was open in 1955 when they had their grand opening. And I think, man, what a difficult time for our country and for the world. The Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement beginning. This is what was happening as Walt Disney was imagining a place to bring joy and happiness to children and their families. And it was just this last week that it occurred to me how very fearful a time that was in our country. how dark it felt to almost everyone that lived during that time. It was fearful, it was dark, it was confusing, and it was also a very anxious time, politically and when we think of what was going on in the world. It was a tough time. And yet, Walt Disney kept imagining during this very difficult time in our country's history what might bring joy to children and their families. And by the time the park opened in 1955, every child and every parent in this country knew about Disneyland. In fact, in 1957, when my parents moved from Hilo on Hawaii Island to California, my sister remembers my mom and dad telling her, "There's Disneyland there. You'll get to go to Disneyland." Of course, my sister to this day says, I didn't get to go to Disneyland with my parents ever because then I had 3 younger brothers and we could never afford to go. And by the time I was old enough to go, my sister was out of the house and everything. But nevertheless, my heart goes out to my sister, and I love her to death, and we have actually done many, many fun things together on vacation. But when I think of my 2 brothers and my parents going to Disneyland, I remember it so clearly as if it were yesterday. I remember driving into the parking lot and seeing more cars than I had ever seen in my life. And it was the first time I had ever seen parking attendants, people that were over here going like this to everyone and telling them, where to park and all that. And I remember getting on the tram, because the parking lot was so big, getting on the tram from one end of the parking lot all the way to the front gate. And I remember thinking, this is awesome. I was already enjoying my first ride at Disneyland. It just went on and on, the monorail, the railroad, the little boats. And, back then, it was pretty cheap to go to Disneyland, and they had A, B, and C tickets. Remember those? And if you wanted to go on, one of the really expensive rides, you need one of those tickets, the mid-expensive rides, the other one, the B one, and then the really cheap rides just for the kids, like the teacups and Dumbo. And so, that's what I remember going on as a little kid. And I remember thinking, I can't wait till I'm old enough to go on a B ride. And then, who knows, maybe one of these days I'll live long enough to actually go on the Matterhorn, on that really fast car that went all throughout the mountain. Well, anyway, as I think about Disneyland and what an incredibly imaginative Walt Disney was, it's very clear to me that what he imagined back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s still lives today. It's in here. It will never go. It's in here. I will always have this connection to the imagination that this great man had for children and families, not only in our country, but throughout the world. Everybody from every country that was a kid that came to America seemed to want to go to Disneyland. And now there's other Disney theme parks. The imagination continues, and the joy and happiness that he envisioned during that very dark time in the world continues. And I think it's important for us to remember what was going on in the world during that time, because many of us feel that today. When we turn on the news and we look at what's going on in our own country and how people can't seem to talk to each other and politicians don't seem to care what anybody thinks about if they're on that side of the aisle, and what's happening with with immigrants that come to this country, and as I think about a nation that's full of mostly immigrants and how so many of us resist any new immigrants, and another 2 instances of mass shootings or shootings in schools and public places just this week. The list goes on, and to me, I think what I feel when I watch the news today must be an awful lot like what my parents felt when they were watching the news back in the 1950s. And well, the 1940s and 50s is when my parents probably watched the news. And then when I came along, of course, in 1960, they kept watching the news. But I'm remembering that back then it must have felt very fearful for them, very dark, very confusing, and very anxious. And so to me, the message of Walt Disney is, even during those very dark times in our country and in the world, the imaginative spirit can do so much good and bring so much joy and bring so much hope. And long after Walt Disney left us in 1966, he continues to have that impact. And I see that over and over again as I read biographies and as I read history. And right now I'm reading the book Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow. And I am amazed at the imaginative spirit of Mr. Hamilton. And I was fortunate to see Hamilton on Broadway with my son a couple years ago. But reading all the details of his life, I think, wow, what a fearful and dark and confusing and anxious time he lived through as he was imagining what this new nation could be like. I had no idea what the Revolutionary War was really like for him until I read this book. And even though he didn't see a lot of battle, he saw the results all around him. And that was a really, really tough time. It was a dark time, and there were so many times when he thought we might not win the war. But we have to keep believing that we will. We have to keep moving forward, and we have to keep acting like we will win. And then, I'm in the part now where the Constitution was just ratified. And I'm sure I must have read some of this in my civics and history courses back in high school and have just forgotten a lot of it. But I think some of this stuff wasn't in the textbooks, go figure. But I am remembering just from the last few days of my reading that the Constitution almost didn't happen. There was so much resistance from many of the more powerful states, or the leaders and the governors and the politicians of those states, and especially New York, where people thought, if we give power to this federal government that Hamilton and Madison and some of the others want, what will happen to our power? It will diminish. We need to continue being separate in so many ways. And Hamilton and Madison and Washington and so many others said, but we need to be united. We need to be the United States of America. And he imagined this government with these three parts that were equal yet separate. And he imagined a place where everybody truly would be free and equal. And Alexander Hamilton had very strong principles, and he got in trouble a lot for opening his mouth at the wrong time. But he was able to be very clear about what he believed. And one of those beliefs had to do with slavery. And he insisted early on that slavery had to be abolished. And even though there were others like Jefferson and Washington who owned slaves that weren't as thrilled about that, Hamilton didn't get his way. But he made it so clear that this country will only thrive and be what it needs to be when slavery is abolished. And he had this vision, and he imagined, and he shared this vision with others. And unfortunately, he died young and didn't get to see the end of slavery, but at least 3 of his children lived through the Civil War, including Alexander Hamilton Jr., to see the end of slavery. But it was really his vision and the vision of people like him in this great imaginative spirit that he would not back away from. He made compromises so that they could move forward in government, in politics. Imagine that. But he kept saying, just think how much better it can be. Let's imagine together, and let's hold on to that imagination. And the spirit of Alexander Hamilton still remains in this country. And if you don't believe me, go see the musical Hamilton. You'll get it. As I was reading Isaiah chapter 65, which was our Old Testament reading this morning, it occurred to me that the prophet Isaiah was very much in line with people like Walt Disney and Alexander Hamilton and those people that made such a difference in their time and in the future. For Isaiah, well, let me explain something really quick. When I talk about Isaiah, I'm talking about the writers of Isaiah. Pretty much all scholars today agree that one prophet or one person, one man, didn't write the whole book because there's 3 sections that are so different, and it's become very apparent that they're written in different times by different people, maybe spanning a time of a couple hundred years even. But when Isaiah 65 was written, it was around the time of the Babylonian captivity where the Jewish people were dragged off to a place called Babylon, a foreign land. And talk about a fearful, dark, confusing, and anxious time. Isaiah was writing in the midst of about as bad as it gets. Isaiah, in chapter 65, is writing from a place that I think many of us can relate to, because I think most of us sense the fear, the darkness, the confusion, and the anxiety of this day, and what we experience in our own lives. But nevertheless, listen to some of the vision from Isaiah. And remember that he not only dreamt this vision, but he invited all of his hearers to take part of it and to continue imagining. So I invite you to hear these words and think about where you might imagine even further. New heavens and new earth, basically indicating a major change of all that is and all that is wrong with the world to something brand new and completely better. Eternal gladness and rejoicing. No more tears, no more crying, no more death at childbirth or in infancy or in childhood or even young adulthood or even middle age. Everyone in this vision will live in good health to at least 100 years old. No more homelessness, no more hunger, no more thirst, no more unemployment, no more war, no more violence, but only God's blessing for everyone. Everyone, even the people out on the margins of society that are often overlooked. And according to Isaiah, even the animals will participate in this nonviolent, peaceful, and life-giving future. Well, when I read that, I think 2 things. One, how wonderful a vision to imagine that and to try to live into it. And secondly, that's just crazy. I mean, seriously? No more war? No more hunger? The animals don't even, all the carnivores become vegetarians all of a sudden? But what this does is it opens us up to imagine what can be and gives us some motivation to move toward that. So, about the time I graduated from high school, one of my favorite writers today, Walter Brueggemann, wrote a book called Prophetic Imagination. And then about 20 years ago, I think I have a copy here, he came out with a revised edition. It's a very small book, but this book is one of the defining books of my ministry because he goes back and looks at the prophets and at Jesus, and he talks about how we together can be a community of faith that imagines just how good the world can be. And we not only imagine what's in the Old Testament and the New Testament, but we continue that imagination because that's what the prophets do. The prophets, including Jesus, invite us to imagine even more than what's in the scriptures. Just imagine how this world can be in the midst of the fear of today, in the midst of the darkness that we feel when we listen to the news or when we experience difficulty in our own lives, in the midst of confusion when we listen to one channel on TV and we hear one thing and we listen to another channel and we're wondering if we're even talking about the same event or the same speech, and the anxiety that we often feel. Imagine. So Walter Brueggemann has a couple things I just wanted to point out. And he says this in his book, in the introduction: the prophetic texts are to be seen as materials that might fund the would-be prophetic voice, that's us, to give wisdom and courage, but which then invite immense imagination to know how to move from such texts to actual circumstances. In other words, when we read Isaiah chapter 65, Isaiah is actually inviting us to figure out what to do with that, how we can live into it, and actually say, okay, the wolves are probably still going to be carnivores when all things are good in the world, but what can we imagine and what can we do? And allowing the imagination to motivate and empower the actions. And then he gives us a warning, Walter Brueggemann in the book, and he says this: established institutions and social conventions are deeply inhospitable to such imagination. Do you get that? When we, as a community of faith, decide that we're going to imagine the world that Jesus imagined, and that we're going to go back even further and imagine the world that the prophets imagined, there's going to be a lot of resistance all around us. For there are people and institutions that benefit greatly from the way things are right now. And prophetic imagination invites us to dream anyway. Amongst the resistance, we become a resistance ourselves. Prophetic imagination allows us to have the courage to not only dream, but to act upon our dreams. When I think of Walt Disney, Alexander Hamilton, the prophets, and Jesus, I think of people who dreamt way beyond what anybody else was dreaming and invited other people in to their communities and said, dream with me. Come and dream. Let's dream together. Let's talk about our dreams. Let's have dinner together and talk about how we can fulfill those dreams right here on this island and in our state and in the world. I invite you to dream, to imagine, to have visions that just seem so unrealistic, but visions that we can hold on to and know that because we are moving into those visions, the world is a better place, not only for us, but for all people, including all of those who are on the margins of society today. I guess I should say societies, because it's not just in our country where people are pushed aside and become invisible because we allow it. I invite you to consider hope in the midst of our own fear and darkness and confusion and anxiety. Because when we do that, we are truly participating in the prophetic imagination of all the Old Testament prophets and of Jesus himself. Amen.